and involves the exchange of information, involves communicating one's own client's underlying interest to the other party. One does not so hide the ball, as an expression used in America. One does not conceal information, but one reveals as much as possible in hopes of treating the negotiating opportunities as a means to solve a problem, not means simply to vindicate the client's interests. The perception of a problem-solving negotiator is acting as a partner, as an affiliate, as a colleague to the person representing the other side's interests. And finally, looking for ways to meet both parties' interests characterizes a problem-solving approach. Now remember, I said that you will run into people characterized by one or another of these approaches. All three can be very useful. And let me give you an example from my own experience. For many years, I was engaged in the practice of law in the American bankruptcy system. Now, in America, you may or may not know this, insolvency law broadly is much broader than in any other country in the world. So many matters are handled in our bankruptcy system, matters that would be handled administratively in every other country. Nonetheless, we handle it in a judicial form. Of course, in any event of insolvency, we know there is a serious problem. The serious problem is that the insolvent entity has insufficient assets to discharge all of its debts and liabilities. Had it sufficient assets, it would not be insolvent. So by definition, we do not have enough money to go around to satisfy the interests of all who assert claims. I had a partner in my practice who was competitive. Maybe I'll rephrase that, who was highly competitive, whose approach was in every respect, in fact, let's go back, in every respect, fills each of these 6 points. He would make extraordinarily high opening demands, he would conceal information, he was argumentative, threatening, he was inflexible in all of these respects. In other words, most of us would not enjoy negotiating with him. Well, that is the kind of person he was. And I would characterize myself as between the cooperative and the problem-solving approaches. We each, working for the same practice firm, understood each other's strengths and styles, and were thus able to deploy each other in an effective way. So often, the style of negotiations would be for my partner and colleague to begin this way. This would have a substantial impact on the other party's negotiations. Perhaps they'd become angry. Perhaps they would be cowed in submission. Nonetheless, it was not the kind of approach that would ultimately lead to a resolution of the matter. At that point, either I would become the cooperative or more likely the problem-solving person. In the American style, we have an idiom that may or may not be familiar to you. If you watch enough American film, you may have heard it. Good cop, bad cop. My partner was the bad cop. He would come in, sort of abuse the other party, verbally only, of course. And then I would come in as the voice of reason and take the shattered expectations of the parties and put them together in what turned out often to be an amicable resolution. So my point here is to suggest that while one of these frames, one of these approaches to negotiation may characterize us, there is room for various approaches, and they can be combined generally between two people, but perhaps some of us can adopt personas, can adopt roles of being competitive in some situations and problem solving in others. I'll leave that to you. Move on to the next one. You might then ask the question, well, what are people in the US like? If you're negotiating with Americans, are they generally the competitive type, the cooperative type, or problem solving? And in fact, most, 2/3 of American lawyers, and I think this would be characteristic of those non-lawyers who negotiate substantial business transactions. Fully 2/3 can be classified as either the cooperative or problem-solving type, and only 1/4 fall clearly within the competitive. Now that might surprise you, thinking again, if you observe Americans only through popular media, that you think we're all highly competitive. And that's simply not the case. However, that does not mean that many of us are not highly competitive. Indeed, many are. So you must not assume in advance, if you are negotiating with Americans, that they are highly competitive, but you must be prepared for that possibility. And again, there's even a geographical distribution of personality types within America, and that need not trouble you here. Well, let's move on back to perhaps some more practical advice here. If one is negotiating, what are some of the steps through which one can approach the process of negotiations? And I have listed here 6. Again, they could be characterized differently, but I think it's important. These are very good. The process involves setting an agenda. What exactly is the matter under negotiations? In some situations, if, for example, it's direct foreign investment, the scope of negotiation, the scope of the agenda is very, very large. If it's simply the sale of goods, the range, the agenda is far narrower. If it's negotiations of a treaty between two nations, well then indeed the agenda can be as vast as the interests of two countries in the world today. There is a process by which an opening position must be communicated. The form of that communication varies a bit from culture to culture, but nonetheless, each party must make some indication of the results it would like to see. Each party should, I believe, at the beginning, indicate those areas within which it is more or less likely to make some concessions. There is a process during negotiations of gathering information. I began by telling you that 3 important words are preparation, 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 including knowledge of the other party's positions and interests. But of course, the opportunity to acquire knowledge of the other party's positions and interests reaches a significant point during the process of negotiations themselves. Then, of course, certain commitments are made. In the tradition here, I believe those commitments are often expressed in terms of a memorandum of understanding, the MOU. Just for your information, that particular expression is not common in the U.S. In the United States, we have, of course, a similar thing. We will often call it a letter of intent. So you can understand MOU and letter of intent largely as expressing the same concept. And when I teach contract law to my American law students, we in fact spend some days discussing letters of intent and their legal implications. While that is not directly germane to your positions here as students of business communication, it is nonetheless important that you have legal advice, because the legal significance of a memorandum of understanding and a letter of intent can vary from country to country, so that what amounts to certain binding obligations from a legal point of view in Taiwan may in fact not be binding legal obligations in America, and vice versa. I'm not here to teach you the law, I'm just here to warn you that the legal significance of these preliminary documents varies from country to country. And finally, the negotiating process at some point must reach a culmination, a conclusion, a closing stage. Well, what are some effective tips for negotiations? I think these are cross-cultural, and I will have some comments later at the conclusion about cultural differences, but I believe these are cross-cultural. First is active listening. The most important thing a negotiator can do is to listen. The second most important thing, and substantially less important thing, is to speak. You must listen for the other party's positions and interests, which means moving from simply understanding the language, which of course is crucial, but understanding the